What price would you pay for a horse that carries more than a rider's weight, one that might carry your destiny? The pressure gauge at Hutchins Mill read 28 and falling when Samuel Garrett rode into Silver Peak that Tuesday morning. He'd covered 18 miles since dawn, following the narrow gauge rail line up from Georgetown, and his gelding was blowing hard in the thin air. The horse needed rest and grain, but Samuel needed something more, pressing a mount that could handle the high country when the snows came heavy. He'd heard about Sarah McKenna's horses from the telegraph operator in Georgetown. "She's got the finest stock between here and Leadville," the man had said, tapping his key with nervous fingers. "But she don't sell to just anybody. Lost her husband to a mine cave-in 2 winters back, and she's been particular about who comes calling since." Samuel guided his gelding down Main Street, noting the way the wind cut between the buildings with a sharp edge that promised a storm. The few people on the street moved with purpose. A woman hurrying toward Hutchins' general store with a basket clutched tight. 2 miners walking fast toward the Silver Bell shop with their heads down. At the far end of the street, where Main forked toward the cemetery and the McKenna place, you could see smoke rising from a chimney, straight up in the still air before the wind caught it and bent it east. The McKenna homestead sat on 40 acres of good grazing land, sheltered from the worst wind by a stand of aspen that had gone golden weeks ago, and now stood bare except for a few stubborn leaves. Samuel could see the barn first, solid timber construction with a good slate roof, and then the house, a modest 2-story frame building with white clapboard siding and green shutters. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, and a yellow light showed in one downstairs window. He dismounted at the gate, feeling the frost in the air bite at his cheeks. The gelding stamped and snorted, eager for warmth and feed. Samuel walked to the front door and knocked 3 times, firm but respectful. The woman who opened the door was not what he'd expected. Sarah McKenna stood perhaps 5'6" in her stockings, with dark hair pinned up practical and brown eyes that looked him over once, complete, before settling on his face. She wore a blue wool dress with the sleeves rolled up past her wrists, and flour dust on her hands suggested he'd interrupted her at some kitchen work. "Mrs. McKenna, I'm Samuel Garrett. I've come about buying a horse." She looked past him to his gelding, tied at the gatepost. "That one looks sound enough," he islanded. "But I need something better, suited to winter travel in the high country. I was told you might have what I'm looking for." Sarah wiped her hands on a dish towel, studying his face. "What kind of work takes a man into the mountains come winter?" "Survey work." "I'm mapping timber stands for the railroad. They want to know what's available for bridge construction next spring." She nodded, as if that explanation satisfied some question she hadn't asked aloud. "I've got 3 horses for sale, 2 mares and a gelding. Come have a look." The barn was warm and smelled of hay and horse and leather. Samuel counted 6 stalls, 3 occupied. Sarah led him to the first stall, where a chestnut gelding stood 16 hands high with good bone and a calm eye. "This is Copper. 7 years old, broke to saddle and pack. He'll carry you steady, but he's not quick." The second stall held a black mare with white markings on her face and legs. Magpie. 5 years old, fast and sure-footed, but she's got spirit. She'll test a rider she doesn't know. The third horse made Samuel stop and look twice. The bay mare stood 15 too, with the kind of conformation that spoke of good breeding and careful handling. Her coat was the color of autumn leaves, and when she turned to look at him, her dark eyes held intelligence. "What about her?" "That's Duchess. 6 years old, sired by the best stallion in the territory." Sarah's voice carried a different note when she spoke of this horse pride, mixed with something that sounded like reluctance. "She's not for sale to just anyone." Samuel studied the mare, noting the way she carried herself, the alertness in her ears, the way she stepped to the front of the stall when he approached. "What would you want for her?" $40. It was more than he'd planned to spend, but looking at the mare, Samuel could see why. This was the kind of horse a man could depend on when everything else went wrong. "May I try her?" Sarah fetched a halter and lead rope. As she slipped the halter over Duchess's head, Samuel noticed the way the mare responded to her touch, calm but attentive, like an animal that knew she was valued. They led the horse out to the corral behind the barn, where Sarah handed him the lead rope. "She'll let you know what she thinks of you." Samuel approached the mare slowly, speaking in low tones. Duchess watched him with interest, but no fear. When he ran his hands along her neck and shoulder, she turned her head to sniff at his coat, then stood quiet while he examined her legs and feet. Good, strong hooves, no heat or swelling in the joints, muscle tone that spoke of regular work. I'd like to ride her. Sarah nodded toward the barn. Saddles on the rack by her stall. The mare stood calm while he saddled her, accepting the bit without fuss. Samuel mounted and felt immediately that this was a horse he could trust. Duchess had an easy gait and responded to the lightest touch of rein or heel. They rode a wide circle around the corral, then out through the gate and up the hill behind the barn. The mare handled the rocky ground with sure feet, never hesitating or stumbling. When they returned to the corral, Samuel dismounted and began unsaddling. She's everything you said she was. She belonged to my husband. The words came quietly, and Samuel looked up to see Sarah watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Thomas broke her himself. Spent 2 years getting her just right. Samuel set the saddle on the fence rail and turned to face her. If you'd rather not sell her, $40, Sarah said again, but now there was something firm in her voice, as if she'd made a decision that couldn't be unmade. She needs to be working, not standing in a stall remembering better days. Samuel reached into his coat and withdrew a bank draft. $42.50. It's what I have. Sarah looked at the draft, then at his face. Denver First National. Yes, ma'am. She folded the paper and tucked it into her coat pocket next to the marriage certificate she'd been carrying like a talisman for 3 years. As her fingers brushed the folded document, she felt something shift inside her chest, not quite hope, but something near to it. There's a storm coming, she said, looking toward the northwest where the sky had gone the color of old pewter. You'll want to get back to town before it hits. Samuel looked at the sky, then at the mare. How long do I have? 3 hours. Maybe 4 if we're lucky. He nodded and began bridling Duchess. As he led her toward the gate where his gelding waited, Sarah called after him. Mr. Garrett. He turned. That mare's been through storms before. Trust her to find the way when you can't see it yourself. Samuel touched his hat brim. Much obliged. Mrs. McKenna. As he mounted the bay mare and took the lead rope of his gelding, Samuel felt the first cold touch of wind from the northwest. By the time he reached the main road, the sky had darkened another shade, and the first few snowflakes were beginning to fall. Behind him, smoke still rose straight up from the McKenna chimney, but he could see the woman standing in her doorway, watching him ride away with $42.50 of her future. What he couldn't see was the hat box sitting on her kitchen table, or the way her fingers went to her coat pocket, where the bank draft rested next to the marriage paper she'd never had the courage to unfold. The snow began in earnest an hour before Samuel reached the Silver Peak Hotel. By the time he'd stabled both horses at Murphy's livery and climbed the front steps, the wind was driving flakes horizontal down Main Street, and the temperature had dropped 15 degrees. The hotel clerk, a thin man named Hutchins, who seemed to own half the businesses in town, looked up from his ledger with relief. Thought you might not make it back. Storms moving in faster than anyone expected. Samuel signed the register and paid for 2 nights. The weather station in Georgetown said it would hold off until Thursday. Weather station don't live up here. Hutchins handed him a room key. Mrs. Patterson's serving beef stew in the dining room, if you're hungry, might be the last hot meal for a day or 2. The dining room was nearly full despite the early hour. Samuel took a table near the window where he could watch the street, though there was little to see now except swirling snow and the occasional figure hurrying between buildings. The stew was good, thick with potatoes and carrots and chunks of tender beef, and the coffee was strong enough to cut the chill that had settled into his bones. He was finishing his second cup when a man in a wool coat and miner's cap stopped at his table. You're the fellow bought Sarah McKenna's bay mare. Samuel looked up. The man was perhaps 50, with the broad shoulders and calloused hands of someone who worked underground. His face was weathered but friendly, and his eyes held the kind of directness Samuel associated with people who made their living from hard, physical work. News travels fast in a small town. Tom Murphy saw you ride past the livery with 2 horses. Said one of them was Sarah's Duchess. The man held out his hand. Jack Morrison, foreman at the Silver Bell. Samuel Garrett. They shook hands, and Morrison took the chair across from him without waiting for an invitation. Mind if I ask what you paid for her? Samuel considered the question. In his experience, miners were straightforward people who respected plain talk. $40. Morrison whistled low. She let that mare go for $40. He shook his head as if he couldn't quite believe it. Thomas McKenna paid $60 for the stallion that sired her, and that was 5 years ago. Horse like Duchess ought to bring 50, maybe 55. Perhaps she needed the money. Maybe. Morrison signaled the waitress for coffee. Or maybe she's finally ready to let go of some things that've been holding her back. The waitress, a young woman with brown hair and a quick smile, brought Morrison his coffee and refilled Samuel's cup. As she moved away, Morrison leaned forward slightly. You know anything about what happened to Thomas McKenna? Only that he died in a mine accident. Morrison nodded slowly. Cave-in at the Lucky Strike, 2 years this December. Thomas was checking timber supports when a whole section came down. By the time we dug him out, he shook his head. Sarah took it hard. Harder than most, maybe because they'd only been married 3 years, and she was expecting their first child. Samuel felt something cold settle in his stomach that had nothing to do with the storm outside. What happened to the child? Lost it that same week. Shock and grief, the doctor said. Sarah hasn't been the same since. Keeps to herself, takes care of her horses, sells a few now and then to make ends meet. But she's been holding on to that bay mare like it was the last piece of Thomas she had left. Morrison sipped his coffee, studying Samuel's face. Fact that she sold Duchess to you says something. Not sure what, but something. Through the window, Samuel could see that the snow was falling heavier now, and the wind was strong enough to rattle the glass. The few people still on the street moved quickly, bent against the weather. How long do these storms usually last? Depends. This one looks like it might be a 3-day blow. Maybe longer. Morrison finished his coffee and stood. You picked a good time to get off the mountain. Road between here and Georgetown won't be passable until the county sends a plow through. After Morrison left, Samuel sat alone at his table, watching the storm build outside. The dining room gradually emptied as people finished their meals and hurried home to wait out the weather. By the time full darkness fell, only a few die-hard drinkers remained at the bar, and the wind outside was howling like something wild and angry. Samuel climbed the stairs to his room on the second floor, a small but clean space with a narrow bed, a washstand, and a chair by the window. He lit the oil lamp and sat down to write his weekly report to the railroad office in Denver. The work was methodical and soothing measurements and timber counts and estimates of board feet per acre. But his mind kept drifting to the woman who'd sold him the bay mare for $10 less than she might have gotten, the marriage paper in her coat pocket, the way she'd looked at him when he mounted Duchess as if she was seeing something that surprised her, the careful way she'd folded the bank draft, tucking it next to whatever document she'd been carrying. Samuel had learned to read people during his years of survey work, moving from town to town and dealing with landowners and local officials and men who might try to cheat a stranger. Sarah McKenna struck him as a woman who'd been holding herself together through will and habit. But something about their transaction had shifted the balance of things in ways he didn't yet understand. Outside, the wind continued to build, and Samuel could hear the rattle of loose shutters and the creak of tree branches bending under the weight of snow. Somewhere in the darkness, Sarah McKenna was alone in her house, with the storm building around her, and $42.50 that represented more than just the sale of a horse. He blew out the lamp and lay down on the narrow bed, listening to the storm. In the morning, if the weather cleared enough, he'd ride out to check the condition of the road toward Georgetown. But tonight, for reasons he couldn't name, his thoughts kept turning to a woman with flour on her hands and a folded bank draft in her pocket, waiting out the storm in a house that had once held more than just memories. The hat box on her kitchen table remained unopened. The storm blew itself out on Thursday morning, leaving Silver Peak under 2 feet of fresh snow and a sky so blue it seemed to ring like a bell. Samuel spent the early hours helping Murphy clear the stable doors and check on the horses. Duchess had weathered the storm well, standing calm in her stall, while other horses stamped and fretted at the wind. When he led her out to the corral for exercise, she moved with the easy confidence of an animal that had learned to trust whatever weather the mountains might send. It was Murphy who suggested he might want to check on Sarah McKenna. "Road to her place drifts bad in storms like this," the stableman said, leaning on his shovel. and she's been alone out there since Tuesday. Might be she could use a hand digging out. Samuel had been thinking the same thing, though he told himself it was simple neighbor courtesy and nothing more. He saddled Duchess and rode out through the fresh snow, following the road that wound between the bare aspen trees toward the McKenna homestead. The mare handled the deep drifts without difficulty, her strong legs cutting through the snow with steady purpose. The McKenna place looked like something from a picture postcard. Snow covered the roof and fence rails in perfect white curves, and the bare trees were outlined in crystal. Smoke rose from the kitchen chimney, straight up in the still air, and he could see where someone had already shoveled a path from the house to the barn. Sarah McKenna emerged from the barn as he rode up, carrying a bucket of grain in each hand. She wore a heavy wool coat and knitted cap, and her cheeks were red from the cold. When she saw him, she set down the buckets and waited. "Morning, Mrs. McKenna, Mr. Garrett." Her voice held a note of surprise that wasn't entirely unwelcome. "I didn't expect to see anyone for several days yet." Samuel dismounted and looped Duchess's reins around the fence post. "Thought you might need a hand with the snow. Drifts can get pretty deep after a storm like that." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, as if trying to read his intentions. Then she nodded toward the barn. "The main doors are blocked. I've been going through the side entrance, but I could use help clearing the front so I can get the wagon out." They worked together in comfortable silence, shoveling the heavy snow away from the barn doors. Samuel was impressed by Sarah's stamina. She worked steadily without complaint, handling the shovel with the easy competence of someone accustomed to physical labor. When they finished, both doors swung open freely, revealing the interior where Sarah's remaining horses stood in their stalls. "Coffee?" she asked as they leaned their shovels against the barn wall. The kitchen was warm and smelled of baking bread. Sarah hung their coats on pegs by the door and poured coffee into heavy ceramic mugs. As Samuel sat at the kitchen table, he noticed the hat box still sitting in the center, unopened but somehow different. The dust had been wiped from its lid, and it sat square in the exact center of the table as if it had been carefully positioned. "Storm hit harder than expected," Sarah said, settling into the chair across from him. "Murphy said the road to Georgetown won't be clear for at least a week." She nodded, sipping her coffee. "Good thing you got that mare when you did. She'll serve you well when you head back into the high country." Samuel found himself studying Sarah's face in the morning light that streamed through the kitchen window. Without the worry lines that had marked her expression during their first meeting, she looked younger. Prettier, too, though he tried not to let that thought settle too firmly in his mind. "Mrs. McKenna, may I ask you something?" "Sarah, and yes, you may ask. When you sold me Duchess, you seemed reluctant, as if parting with her meant more than just losing a good horse." Sarah was quiet for a long time, her hands wrapped around her coffee mug. When she finally spoke, her voice was soft but steady. "Thomas broke that mare himself. Spent 2 years getting her just right, like I told you. She was going to be his riding horse, the one he'd take into the mountains when we went camping in the summer." She paused, looking out the window where Duchess stood next to the fence, her bay coat bright against the snow. "After he died, I kept telling myself I was saving her for some special purpose. But the truth was, I was afraid that letting her go would mean letting go of him. And now?" Sarah looked at him directly, and Samuel saw something in her brown eyes that hadn't been there on Tuesday, a kind of quiet resolution. "Now I think Thomas would want that mare to be working, carrying someone who needs her, not standing in a stall, beautiful and useless." She got up to refill their coffee cups, and as she moved past the hat box, her hand brushed its lid. The gesture was so brief, Samuel almost missed it. But he saw the way her fingers lingered for just a moment, as if she was testing the weight of some decision. "Mr. Garrett Samuel, may I ask you something?" "Of course. What made you come out here to check on me?" It's not as if we're old friends. The question caught him off guard, partly because he wasn't sure he knew the answer himself. "I suppose I was concerned about you being alone out here after the storm." "And?" Samuel looked at her, sitting straight in her chair with the morning light behind her, and found himself speaking more honestly than he'd intended. "And I kept thinking about the way you looked when you sold me, Duchess, like you were making a choice that scared you but felt right anyway." Sarah was quiet for a moment, then she reached across the table and lifted the lid of the hat box. Inside, Nestled in tissue paper was a wedding dress. Not fancy white cotton with simple lace trim and pearl buttons, but carefully preserved and beautiful in its plainness. Thomas's mother gave me this the day before our wedding, said it had been her mother's and her mother's before that. I was supposed to pass it on to my own daughter someday. Sarah's voice was steady, but Samuel could hear the pain underneath. After I lost the baby, I packed it away. Couldn't bear to look at it, but couldn't bear to get rid of it either. She lifted the dress partway out of the box, and Samuel could see the fine stitching, the care that had gone into its making. Yesterday, during the storm, I kept looking at this box and thinking about what you'd said when you bought Duchess, about her needing to be working instead of just remembering. Sarah folded the dress carefully and placed it back in the box. I think maybe I've been doing the same thing Thomas's mother did with this dress, saving something beautiful for a future that might never come instead of letting it be what it was meant to be. Samuel felt something shift in the air between them, a sense of doors opening that had been closed for a long time. What do you think it was meant to be? Sarah looked at him, and for the first time since he'd met her, she smiled. Not the polite, careful smile she'd given him when they'd conducted their business, but something real and unguarded. I think maybe it was meant to remind me that some things are worth the risk of hoping for them. Outside, Duchess whinnied softly, and through the window Samuel could see her standing near the fence, alert and ready. The sun climbed higher, turning the snow to crystal and the sky to the kind of blue that made a man think winter might not last forever after all. The marriage certificate in Sarah's coat pocket seemed lighter somehow, as if the words written on it had changed meaning while she wasn't looking. And for the first time in 2 years, Sarah McKenna began to think that maybe, just maybe, some stories were meant to have second chapters. The news reached Silver Peak on Friday morning with the mail coach from Georgetown. Samuel was checking on Duchess at Murphy's livery when Jack Morrison came striding through the snow with a telegram in his hand and trouble written across his face. Garrisons flooding, Morrison announced to the half-dozen men gathered around Murphy's pot-bellied stove. Snow melted too fast down in the valley, and Clear Creeks jumped its banks, washed out the bridge at Miller's Crossing, and took half the main street with it. Murphy looked up from the harness he was mending. Anyone hurt? 2 men missing, according to this. Morrison waved the telegram. Water's still rising, and they need every able-bodied man they can get for sandbagging and rescue work. Samuel felt a cold knot form in his stomach. Garrison was where he'd left his surveying equipment and field notes, 3 months of work, locked in a hotel room safe. More than that, his contract with the railroad called for him to deliver his final reports by the 1st of December. If the flood had reached the business district, everything he'd worked for might be sitting at the bottom of Clear Creek. How bad is the road between here and there? He asked. Morrison consulted the telegram again. Passable as far as Silver Plume, but you'd have to go the long way around through Bakerville and down the South Fork. Add 2 days to the journey, minimum. Samuel did quick calculations in his head. Today was Friday, the 18th of November. If he left immediately and the roads held, he might reach Garrison by Sunday evening. Time enough to assess the damage and salvage whatever could be saved, but it would mean riding hard through country that could turn treacherous without warning. I need to get there, he said, reaching for Duchess's saddle. Not alone. You don't. Morrison folded the telegram and tucked it into his coat. I'm riding down to help with the rescue work anyway. We can travel together as far as Silver Plume. An hour later, Samuel was saddling Duchess in front of the McKenna house, while Sarah watched from her front porch. He'd ridden out to tell her he was leaving, though he wasn't entirely sure why he felt the need to explain his departure to a woman he'd known for less than a week. Floodwater's unpredictable, Sarah said as he tightened the cinch. Creek that looks safe in the morning can kill you by afternoon. I'll be careful. She came down the steps and handed him a cloth bag tied with string. Biscuits and dried beef. You'll need food that won't spoil if you get delayed. Samuel accepted the bag, noting the way her fingers brushed his as she passed it over. Thank you. I'm not sure when I'll be back. The railroad work, is that important? It's my livelihood. If I don't deliver those reports on time, I won't see another contract. He paused, looking at her standing in the snow with the morning sun bright on her dark hair. Sarah, about yesterday. Don't say anything you might regret, she interrupted gently. Just ride safe and come back when you can. Samuel mounted Duchess and looked down at Sarah McKenna one more time. In her wool coat and knitted scarf, with her cheeks red from the cold and her brown eyes serious, she looked like something a man might spend his whole life trying to find. "I'll be back," he said, and knew as he spoke the words that he meant them as more than just a polite farewell. The ride to Silver Plume took most of the day, even with Morrison pushing the pace. They followed the narrow road that wound between snow-covered peaks, crossing streams swollen with runoff and navigating patches where avalanche debris had been hastily cleared. Morrison proved to be good company, a steady rider who knew when to talk and when to save his breath for the work of travel. At Silver Plume, they parted ways. Morrison would continue south toward Georgetown and the main road to Denver, while Samuel would follow the mining trail over Bakerville Pass and down into the Clear Creek Valley from the north. "You sure about going alone from here?" Morrison asked as they shared a final meal at the Silver Plume Hotel. Samuel looked out the window where fresh snow was beginning to fall. "Duchess has been through worse country than this, and I can't afford to wait for better weather." "That mare's got good sense," Morrison agreed. "Trust her judgment if things get dicey." Samuel left Silver Plume before dawn on Saturday, following a trail that climbed steadily through pine forest and aspen groves toward the pass. The snow was deeper here, and Duchess had to work hard to break trail, but she moved with the steady confidence Sarah had promised. By midday, they'd reached the summit, where Samuel could look down into the Clear Creek Valley and see the brown scar of floodwater cutting through the white landscape. The descent was treacherous. The trail switched back down a steep slope where snow had turned to ice in the morning cold. And more than once, Samuel felt Duchess's hooves slip before she caught herself and continued down. He gave her her head, trusting her to pick the safest route, and was rewarded when they reached the valley floor without mishap. The closer they got to Garrison, the more evidence Samuel saw of the flood's power. Trees stripped of bark and left hanging in the branches of other trees, 30 feet above the normal creek bed. Boulders, the size of houses, moved half a mile from where they'd started. A freight wagon overturned and buried in sand, with only one wheel showing above the debris. Garrison itself was a shock. The main street, which Samuel remembered as a neat row of false-fronted businesses, was now a wasteland of mud and wreckage. The hotel where he'd been staying was still standing, but its first floor was packed with sand and debris, and the front windows were blown out. Men with shovels and wheelbarrows worked steadily to clear the worst of the mess, while women moved among them with coffee and sandwiches. Samuel found the hotel owner, a German immigrant named Brennan, supervising the cleanup of what had been the lobby. Brennan looked up as Samuel approached, and his weathered face broke into a grin of recognition. "Mein Gott, Garrett. I thought you were dead somewhere in the mountains. I was in Silver Peak when the storm hit. What about my room? My equipment and papers?" Brennan's expression grew sober. "Second floor took some water, but not as bad as down here." "Your room?" He shrugged. "We'll know when we get the stairs cleared and can go up and look." It took until Sunday evening to dig out enough debris to make the staircase passable. Samuel climbed to the second floor by lamplight, his boots squelching on carpets soaked with floodwater and mud. The door to his room hung off its hinges, and the interior was a chaos of overturned furniture and water-stained walls. But his surveyor's transit, packed in its wooden case, was still sitting on the dresser where he'd left it, and the hotel safe, bolted to the floor in what had been Brennan's office, had held. Samuel's field notes and maps were damp, but readable, his camera and photographic plates intact. "You're luckier than you deserve," Brennan said as they carried Samuel's salvaged equipment down to the lobby. That safe was under 3 feet of water for 6 hours. Samuel spread his maps on a makeshift table and began checking them by lamplight. 3 months of careful surveying, thousands of measurements and calculations that represented timber stands worth hundreds of thousands of dollars to the railroad. All of it safe, though some pages would need to be recopied before they could be submitted. "How long before I can get these to Denver?" he asked. Brennan scratched his beard. "Road's still out between here and Georgetown. Maybe a week. 10 days before they get it passable again." Samuel looked at his maps, then at the calendar on Brennan's desk, the 22nd of November. The railroad expected his final report by the 1st of December, and he still had 3 days of copying work ahead of him just to make the water-damaged pages presentable. Is there any other way to get word to Denver? Telegraph lines down too. Won't be back up until they replace the poles between here and Silver Plume. Brennan paused, studying Samuel's face. You look like a man with his back against the wall. Something like that. Samuel spent Monday and Tuesday recopying damaged pages and preparing his final report. By Wednesday morning, he had everything ready, packed in a leather satchel that could survive another flood if necessary. But the road to Georgetown was still impassable, and the telegraph line remained down. It was then that he remembered Sarah McKenna's words about Duchess. Trust her to find the way when you can't see it yourself. Samuel saddled the bay mare before dawn on Wednesday and started back towards Silver Peak, taking the same route he'd used on the trip down. But this time, instead of stopping at Silver Plume, he would continue north to the railroad terminus at Georgetown, then catch the first train to Denver. If the road from Silver Peak to Georgetown was passable, he could still make his deadline. The ride back took 2 days, pushing hard through snow that had turned crusty and treacherous. Duchess never faltered, finding her footing on ice-covered rocks and breaking trail through drifts that came up to her belly. By Thursday evening, they were climbing the last hill before Silver Peak, and Samuel could see the lights of the town spread out below them like stars against the snow. He was 2 days ahead of his deadline, with his contract secure and his future with the railroad assured. But as Duchess picked her way down the familiar road toward the McKenna house, Samuel realized that success felt different now than it had 3 months ago. The work was the same, the money was the same, but something had changed in the space between Tuesday morning and Thursday evening. Sarah McKenna was standing in her doorway when he rode up to the fence, as if she'd been waiting for the sound of hoofbeats on the road. In the lamplight spilling from her kitchen, she looked exactly as he'd left her, and nothing like the woman who'd sold him a horse for $40 and started him thinking about futures that might include more than just the next survey contract. Some journeys end with a map delivered. His ended with a door opening toward a life uncharted.